Assalamu alaikum, Damateen, to all of you, and good evening to all of you who came to and listen to our amazing Dr. Abira. And the session tonight is the Anglo Somali Society. And most of you definitely know Anglo Somali Society is one of the oldest institutions that we have in here, which became 60 last year. And it is friendship and society in a membership. And we have been part of the Somali Week since the beginning, I think. And tonight's session, actually the theme of Somali Week this year is Trailblazer and Innovators. And we have got one of our amazing young students who are experts in that area, Abira Hussein. And Abira, if I tell you something about her, is a curator of a digital and virtual reality exhibitions of Somali cultural artifacts and images from before the Somali Civil War. She's an independent researcher and curator specializing in Somali heritage, digital archives, urban cultures, and GLAM. In recent years, Abira has worked with the Barbican Magnum Photos, British Museum, the National Archives, and the other organizations to deliver a number of projects and workshops engaging with the Somali community and research the heritage sector. In 2017, she created the VR Experiencing Coming Home in partnership with the British Museum and funded by the Brighton Digital Festival and shown at Essex Humanity Lab. In 2018, she developed a partnership with Nemesis, the Nomad Project, a mixed reality experience that explored the creative use of immersive mixed reality and web-based technology to contextualize archival Somali objects with the people and traditions. I think Abira will be able to tell us. It will be a presentation from her, and then the questions will be followed. So she will tell us who she is and some of our work. Welcome again.
Thank you, Rhoda, for inviting me to participate in this conversation and to have an opportunity to talk about my work. Thanks also to Somali Week Festival as well, which I have been a part of, which has continued to support my work. It's very warming to have the support of your community and that to be a space where you can experiment and produce work. So when Rhoda approached me to talk about this, I thought about the best way to kind of talk about innovation and digital archives and some of the challenges that I've faced, both working in the sector and then trying to develop work that explores themes around cultural identity, diaspora, colonialism, and the contact between Somalis living in East Africa and the British, and also the other colonial presence from Europe. I thought I would do a chronology of the projects that I've been involved in as a way to kind of demonstrate that and hopefully give you an idea of the work that I was doing and the motivations for it. So this is not the first project that I did around archives and heritage, but it was the first that made me think about the connection of ethnographic objects and archives. I had previously engaged with digital archives on a project led by Autograph, Association of Black Photographers, which was the first agency supporting black photographers that was established in the 1980s, not too far from here. They did a project called The Missing Chapter, which was exploring the missing chapters of history and challenging the presence that Black and Asian people only arrived in the late 20th century. And so this had photographs from the mid-19th century and early 20th century. And when I started to look through the archives and records to think about what representation did exist of Somalis, it was often quite either ethnographic focused, images that were staged, images that didn't really depict the Somali community that I knew and understood. All the archives often had records of Somalis later in the 90s and early 2000s, often referring to things relating to housing, health issues. I was often exploring archives within the London Metropolitan Archives, Wellcome Gallery. So the focus was, sometimes you would see some presence of seamen, but often when you look at archives that relate to the black community, it's only when there are particular issues, court cases, moments of conflict where you start to see a better depiction or get to see more than just the name or a passing reference. So I found it quite difficult engaging with those archives, found it quite an othering experience. And so that led to a project that I did, which was beginning to photograph images from before the Civil War. As Rhoda mentioned in my bio, I was particularly interested in that time before Civil War and after independence. There's a certain nostalgia that I think most Somalis, younger Somalis, would have heard of that period of time in the 70s and 80s where things were blissful, Somalis were free, there was a kind of a somewhat euphoric sense that people were able to live and to be, and then there was this disruption, this dislocation, this movement to the UK and, you know, and a dispersal across Europe, and suddenly that past was no longer tangible, was often retold, and as what I describe as post memories, second-hand memories that we had to kind of live with. And so that was my first foray into archiving. But this project here, which is still actually up in the British Museum Wellcome Gallery, was called Object Journeys. And it was exploring how to work with, as the British Museum called it, source communities, and to retell and to curate collections from their stores. And this exhibition was called Objects of Survival. It was ethnographic objects, so the collections that were usually collected were everyday objects relating to the pastoral community. So these might be milk vessels, pestle and mortar, baskets, sandals, and so we were interested in how to depict everyday life, but also thinking about the harshness of pastoralism. But there was also beauty in it. This practice wasn't just useful, it was functional, but also poetic. It was weaved in with art and also our oral traditions as well. And that was something that I came to realise was actually missing, that contextual information, that relation with people, with space, with land, was missing. Often museums, as some of you know, was a product or part of the colonial encounter and was part of representing kind of the treasures and what was collected and displayed. And so museums, as I saw them, were kind of external frontiers of colonialism. And me, as a Somali, my contact with that somewhat felt a bit like whiplash, that I was kind of being taken back and forth into the past, and not necessarily a pleasant encounter. But part of this exhibition led to the digitization of objects into, so this was a process called photogrammetry, which can be used, can be achieved through either photography, LiDAR scanning, and that allows you to digitize images in 3D. So what you have is three mobile assets that you can then put into either a games engine or to share online. And so it allowed the objects to be mobile, and that was interesting to me. And also what it did bring up was issues around ownership and copyright. A lot of these objects, even though they are out of copyright, once digitized, then become subsumed back into the museum's ownership. And so this was the first time when I started to realize that actually a lot of digital objects that are available online are under a restrictive license. And so part of this issue was thinking about innovation and heritage, but also there are limits and boundaries that are in place when it comes to accessing our cultural heritage. So, but these objects, because they were publicly funded, it meant that they were available under an open license, and that means that the public can use it for creative purpose, not for commercial purposes, but it can be used for creative purpose and for educational purposes. So that led to a project that I did with a company called Museum in a Box, which was thinking about how to take objects out of the museum into the public, how to make them tactile, how to add sound, how to create ways of engagement that allow people to have better responses to the objects. Learning is often multisensorial, and that was about reflecting that. And so, as you can see from the white objects, those were digitized using a 3D printer. And so what you see is an incense burner, a gourd, which was used for carrying water, a headrest, and a basket. And there's a small box just in the middle with a blue individual, and that's inside there is called the brain, which has Raspberry Pi. And then the objects had an RFID tag, which then allowed you to place the object on and hear the sound. And that's when I started to recognize that there was an opportunity to start to fully flesh out the cultural heritage that is often experienced in museums, as a lot of these objects are pastoral objects and which are often associated with work songs. We had the opportunity then to get the license from the British Library and then connect those work songs to those objects. And so that was the kind of first instance of thinking about how to use the digital objects as a way of further enhancing their engagement. And so that was a project that I was able to take out into schools, into workshops, as a way of communicating about kind of Somali culture heritage. And so then that started to get me thinking about immersive technologies. This was done in 2017. There was still discussion around the use of immersive technology in gaming. This is a kind of screenshot of a rock art site in Lascelles. Again, I was thinking about the mobility of the objects, thinking about an immersive experience, and the idea of thinking about the affordances of technology to replicate space, the objects, to include sound, and to think about whether these digital headsets could take you back home. By that point, I hadn't been to Somalia, or had never been before, and so I was thinking about the role of technology of being able to allow me to transport digitally and to try to experience a more embodied understanding of Somali culture. And so that was using VR. So for those that don't know, virtual reality is when you have a complete virtual environment. So you wear a headset and you completely see a virtual space or a virtual experience. There should be a video here. And this led to then the next stage of the project, which was a collaboration with Nemesis. I'll show the video afterwards, which was exploring the use of a games engine called Unity, which is often behind many of the games that you see, thinking about the idea of connecting these somewhat disparate collections and archives, and thinking about the affordances of the immersive space to bring them together. This was using mixed reality. Unlike virtual, you can see your reality as well as a virtual overlay. And I was using that to think about the tensions that we have as a diaspora community, kind of holding multiple identities, and the tension between being both British and Somali, and often feeling like you have to choose both experiences, or often you're racialized as one way, but actually you inhabit multiple identities that may not necessarily be visible. And so this experience was also mobile, so I was thinking about the nomadic experience being something that was mobile, that was migrating, and that was, yeah, so this is a short video that we did. Hopefully it will play. Oh. Am I going to be able to get it to play, the video? Sorry?
Yes.
Oh, it's having a bit of a... Sorry, the back of my head isn't very interesting. So this, the video will show, once you wear the headset, you have an option of 3 objects, and then you get to tap one, and then what you would see is an individual using the object, so you'll be able to see how the object would have been used, what sounds you might have heard. It was not necessarily a recreation of the past, but thinking about a reproduction and I don't think it's going to. So this was, as I mentioned, using mixed reality, and at the time museums were kind of exploring ways of animating their objects. As you understand, museums are quite static. The representation of culture is very static, whereas Somali culture is quite dynamic. It's multivocal. Sorry? Okay, it's collective, and kind of intangible and tangible heritage is experienced on a continuum. And so I felt a lot of tension with the heritage sector, where a lot of archives and museums and libraries or geography, all these disciplines somewhat separate heritage from each other. And you know, historically, a lot of this heritage, it kind of turns heritage something that was quite systematized, professionalized. And so community, the living knowledge and heritage of elders often doesn't exist within museums, or if it is, it's somewhat placed further down, and there's a hierarchy. And so what I was trying to challenge was that idea that actually this living knowledge is authoritative, it's accurate, and it represents our heritage and is often missing. So questions that have often come up when I have done this work is, how do you prove the authenticity of the knowledge that you're gathering and you're digitizing? Because within museums and archives, this idea of provenance, having an ownership, a single owner, being able to pinpoint the origin of where this knowledge began is important. And so I was trying to counter this idea that actually knowledge can be circular. Is there sound? There is, if there's no sound, there is subtitling as well.
Nomadic Somali people walk great distances, never staying in one place for too long. With each move, they take all their belongings with them, their animals, their possessions, even their homes. Imagine you had to carry all your belongings with you. What would you take? We would like to invite you to spend some time with the nomadic family, to see the objects and hear the songs which are part of their everyday lives. To find out more about these and other Somali objects, please visit nomadproject.co.uk.
Okay. No, it's finished, yeah.
Okay.
And then the next is if you could play this video. So part of the project was having the immersive experience, but also inviting people to bring in their own objects to crowdsource an archive. As I mentioned, part of the current practice of a lot of museums is either through the digitization of culture heritage, maintaining copyright so that even though this relates to our culture, we don't have access to it. And so part of this was thinking about how to create an archive where there was open access, which means that it's accessible online for people to download and to reuse. And that was an important part. So we had workshops where we invited participants to bring in the objects, digitize them, and then included them in the archive. And so you can see here, they were digitized, and 3D objects, photographs and sounds were also digitized. Some of this work then, so as I was continuing exploring archives, that we collaborated with the Powell Cotton Museum, which are based in Kent. They have the largest collection of ethnographic objects. Diana Powell Cotton was the daughter of Percy Powell Cotton, who was someone that was interested in games hunting, collecting animals, but she was much more interested in anthropology, and so Somalia was or Italian Somaliland was the first areas that she visited where she collected up to 3,000 objects, and that included objects, photographs, as well as ethnobotany collections. So an extensive archive that was donated to the Pitt Rivers as well as British Museum. And as part of the I'll go back to that one, was this collection of photographs from the Bajuni community, which is an archipelago to the south of Kismayo, which is southern Somalia, that goes into Kenya. And so this was a Somali community that has faced marginalization within the Somali community and not and have had faced marginalization as well as violence from the Somali community. And it was interesting to, as a Somali, I was unaware of this community, but also to think about what archives can do to recover and to retell stories. These photographs that you see were involved in the Somali Object Journeys project earlier on the year. And an individual actually screenshot one of the photographs, and they were able to identify the community members in this photograph, in these archives. The island is very small, a few hundred live on these islands. Most people know each other. And so this led to a guy called Faiz Shi, who was able to, with his uncle's help, identify his great-grandmother and her sisters, which is not often the case. When you're accessing archives and looking at archives from your community, they tend to be anonymous. Often there are no names. It's very vague. And so here we had the opportunity to, and Diana Cotton's practice was different in the sense that she had more intimate relationships with the Somalis that she was engaging with, where there were records of, and her field notes were quite extensive. There were records of the people that she engaged with, the names of the objects, of the people that she bought objects with, and that was able to help us to identify. And so we started to explore this idea of living lineages, as well as the consent and what it means to recover these archival images, where some of the Bajuni communities still face discrimination and actually are denied citizenship from the Somali community. And so this was something that was thinking about the role of archives in both, as I mentioned, retelling the past, but also being able to speak to issues that communities are facing now. This was a commission by Magnum Photos, which was inviting emerging photographic writers to look at their collections and their archives and to respond to them. And for me, this was quite challenging because the majority of the archives within the Magnum collection were of either, well, there were some photographs that documented the Pan-African movement, but they were mainly documenting famine and the impacts of famine. And so I was thinking a lot about the iconography of famine and how certain communities are represented and the gaze with which black and marginalized communities are seen, and photography being a tool of that. And so my response here was to really question the role of archives and the role of archival institutions in replicating violence, in not representing communities, and having and also thinking about how when there are missing archives, when there is absence, when there is bias, how then we can use storytelling as a way of being able to recover and reimagine histories. And so the final bit is to talk about an upcoming project that will be happening on the 14th of November at 3 p.m. This is a radio commission with BBC for Shortcuts. It's called Fish and Chips, as some will be aware, is the name that often I got called by elderly aunties referring to diaspora who were raised here. This is a product of my PhD research. I was working with 5 aunties where we visited the British Museum, the British Library, and I was talking to them about the collections, their experiences of these archival songs, these objects, what they remember, what Somali community means today, the complication of diaspora and identity with movement, whether these identities were ever so fixed and unambiguous, and really thinking about that actually there was always contact, there was always plurality, and that the past wasn't such a simple space that was, peaceful, and actually there were multiple communities living in Somalia. And so this piece is kind of thinking about the role of diaspora and different ways of thinking about how identities can coexist, how different traditions and knowledges can coexist, the tensions of them, as well as the potential beauty of it as well. And and so it's a 10-minute piece and will be coming out, as I mentioned, on that date, and hopefully will reflect some of the things that I've been talking about and begin to, share some of those stories.
Okay, I really think, thank you so much, Abira. That's a lot to take in, really. So we will have 5-minute questions, if you have any. And before that, I just want you, if any one of you really wants to be a member of the Anglo Somali Society, the forms are there. Some of the journalists, the copies of some of the journalists we have gathered also there. And we would love to have you. So I can't see.
Oh, there's one.
Is that Conrad? No. Do you have any questions for Abira? Yeah, technology. So, Hussein, Dr. Hussein.
Just would like to ask a question. To what extent do you have a relationship or communication with the local Armenian people back home who are interested in heritage and museum activities? I know one in the Hargeisa Syrian Museum, and there will be others as well, of course. Do you have contact with them?
I mean, I went back to Hargeisa for the first time this year, so I was able to visit the book fair and to see the museum, and the project that I did in 2017 with Lascale was actually with a photographer called Mustafa Saeed, who was in Hargeisa. He photographed the rock art sites for me. They had historically been recorded by SciArc, which is a company which does scans, LiDAR scans, but the issue that I found was that actually we didn't have any access to that cultural material. So sometimes when there's a perceived lack of infrastructure, you often have international bodies that came in that digitized, but we didn't have access to it. So that was a collaboration with a Somali photographer. And I have been in touch with individuals who are currently working on building the National Somaliland Museum, supporting them with capacity building around their archival and museum collections, and thinking about kind of processes and things they can put in place to make these collections accessible. But my work doesn't reflect, it's in connection to the Somali community, but as a diaspora, I try to reflect the diaspora experience of engaging with cultural heritage and what that means. I don't try not to speak for the Somali community based in either Somalia or Somaliland or Djibouti or the other regions.
Okay, and anyone else? Can see you, yeah. Magacaaga.
Yeah, Marie, I know.
Okay.
Amazing work, and thank you so much for sharing. You talked about the crowdsourcing archive. how is that something that's ongoing, that you continue to build and expand, and also how is that accessible to the larger demographic in the group, for example, aren't direct contributors to the archive, or how can people also contribute to the archive as well?
So this was, we had a bit of funding, those who work in the sector, funding tends to often dictate how much you can do. This was part of the showcasing of the Magnum project. So we had 3 workshops. The objects and the photographs that were that individuals donated to be kind of digitized are available on the Nomad Project website. So that was nomad-project.co.uk. So they are downloadable there. The hope is to be able to build that capacity into the website where people can share and upload. That would be the ideal way of being able to do that. I did, my first attempt at crowdsourcing was actually a Facebook group called, I think, Somali Portraits from Before the War, where I invited participants to bring in, or individuals to bring in photographs, to share photographs on Facebook, and that was a closed group. Part of the challenge of crowdsourcing is thinking about the quality of the images, how people digitize them. There are ways where individuals can kind of photograph and record. There's a good example in America, which is the South Asian American Diaspora Archive, where they have a mechanism which allows people to share in short audio clips or photographs. And so part of the issue was that I had limited funding and resource, and so I didn't have the capacity to be able to really fully develop that, and to. But I mean, that ideally would be the hope, that we have the capacity to support people, because actually a lot of many of the issues of Black and marginalised communities archives is not having the resource to digitise collections and then maintain them. And so part of the Nomad project is that our archives are hosted on GitHub. But what I have discovered with my research, such with the National Archives, that community archives are recognised as critically endangered. So often they don't have the technical resource or the funding to support the longevity of their collection. And so already a community that is erased becomes further erased by a lack of resource and support. And that is an ongoing issue with collections and archives that are Black-led, where there is limited funding. And this happens even in the continent, where as I mentioned, the lack of infrastructure then allows independent people who are not from those communities to digitise and own our collections. So it's an ongoing issue, actually, of thinking about digital capacity. At the moment, Flickr Foundation, the Internet Archive, or Wikipedia are the only platforms where you can upload and make your content available, but it still means that you have to make it open, and you may not wish to make it open. Actually, one of the issues that we have with the Black community is that we don't get to decide the terms of service. You have to either use big tech platforms or you have to make it available. So I'm working on a project with the Black Southwest Network, who are based in Bristol. The project is called the Unmuseum. We're in the development stage at the moment, and we're trying to explore how do we reimagine public domain, copyright, how do we undo some of the kind of the legacies of museums, and think about digitalization and ownership and infrastructure that is Black-led. That means that we can upload our content in an ethical and to where we have sovereignty over our material, where we maintain stewardship of it, because that's the most important thing. I mean, representation is great, but actually the mechanisms that allow that are really important as well.
Okay, and one last question for that guy, and then I can't see you, the reflection, but I can see the hand.
Thank you so much. It's really inspiring, especially for other people who are trying to do their PhDs. And I had a question. I know you said you didn't want to speak too much about the situation in Somaliland, but just something, a comparative question that came to my head. You're making really interesting points about the need to kind of read archives critically, and the question about who is silent within them and how it has to revisit and see how history tends to get constituted by the victors, and archives have to be read against the grain. And I wondered how your equivalent people, your fellow archivists and people exploring archives in Somaliland, in Somalia, do you see them also attempting to kind of revisit archives critically and think about, okay, versus the particular current narratives of our politics, that these archives suggest a different kind of history and so on? Do you see sort of echoes in the attempt to read archives critically in different regions?
It's difficult. I think it's an interesting question. And a very good one. I noticed the Anne Stoler reference. I think by, in some ways, by practice, I think there is an element where you are still following the same narrative or structures of archives and replicating those structures. But also, I think what I'm seeing is some opportunities where some of that plurality or different voices are being represented in the archive. I mean, one of the archives that I know of is in the Hargeisa International Book Fair, where they are thinking about including songs, trying to relate different contextual information that is often missing in archives, where it might just be a certain creator and their record collection. What I'm saying is they're also connecting it to other moments in history, other creators, and actually making links that necessarily don't exist in the archive. I think, but for me, where I see that happening is in the living space, where archives are being kind of in performance, in events, where some of this remembering is happening in a much more embodied and living way, rather than necessarily being fixed into or recorded and then being shared. I think that has a place and a role, but what I'm much more interested in is in the performative element. So I'm seeing it really mainly in art spaces. There's an art space called Fankena, based in Hargeisa, where art and conversation and the archives are interacting with that. So I think, and they recently did a project which hopefully will be coming out with a collective based in Berlin. So I'm seeing that more frequently. I can't say I have concrete examples of it. I know that the Somaliland Museum as well now is collecting objects and collecting archives. But my fear is to not continue the museum and the archival tradition, which I feel like the assumption is that if we want to do a professional job, that's how we have to do it. Rather than kind of trying to reimagine a way that reflects our knowledge practice, our ways of engaging with the past, thinking how people are doing it. I think most of that actually is really being reflected in the social media space, through TikTok, through blogging, where that technology is better able to reflect the oral cultures of, particularly I'm thinking about the Black community, is able to better reflect, and so that's where people are creating art, creating heritage, creating culture, and there's a bit of a gap between what people are doing in that space, in reenacting and reusing and remixing, and what the heritage world is doing with an online website and a database where you click on an object and then you see the catalogue description and that's it. So the Museum is thinking a lot about how to bring in all these different elements together and how someone might experience that, but not necessarily. And I know that in Ethiopia as well, they have an extensive archive and the Ethiopian National Library is also exploring that. I sense I should stop talking.
Yeah, I really think that that's all we have time for today. I don't think that we could finish about the knowledge of Abira. I must thank you, Abira, who really came all the way with her two children, young children today. And yeah, I really would like very much to work with you in Brand, because we have got a lot of heritage programs in there. So thank you for the audience as well for coming. Please don't forget to Don't forget to involve with us and then take the books as well. Thank you so much.